I'm going to be talking today about a very different type of digital technology than what's been discussed so far at this conference. In many ways, it's going to be a combination of old and new media in what I find to be a very interesting way. It's basically the digitization of historic newspapers, and we're to the point now where there are literally millions of historic newspapers that have been digitized and are available for search on the web. And it's so important to the type of work I do. I am primarily a film historian. One of my research interests is how, basically looking at the place of women within the early United States movie industry, and by early I mean 1920s and earlier. And I've been engaged in this work since the early 1980s off and on. And during that time, I would characterize my work as in the trenches type of historical writing, where I spent countless hours slogging through I don't know how many microfilm reels and making pilgrimages to various archives, in remote locations. All of that has changed. All of that has changed now. We are to the point where an incredible number of digitized newspapers, and not only general circulation newspapers, but also what are called trade journals in the movie business, are now available on the web. Just this past summer, there's an organization called the Digital Media History Project. They mounted a website in collaboration with the wonderful folks at archive.org, in which they've placed many movie industry trade journals from the early 1900s all the way into the 1960s on this website. Magazines such as Moving Picture World, Variety, the New York Clipper, as well as fan magazines such as Photoplay, which is probably the most famous of all. And it gives some, because oftentimes these magazines will have interviews with prominent filmmakers during that time. So it's an incredible wealth of material that's now available on the web. Now, one of the people that I've been researching for the past few years is a person named Lois Weber. And I'd just like to take a moment. How many of you have heard of Lois Weber? Does that name ring a bell with anyone? 3, 4 people? That says something, okay? That says something to me, because in her day, she was just as famous as any man. She made hundreds of movies, about 100 years ago. Hundreds of movies. There's a moment in her career that just blows me away. During a 3-year period in her career, without a break, she made 1 movie per week. 1 movie per week. Now, we're not talking about feature-length films. We're talking about what was called the one-reeler movie, a movie that might run perhaps 14 or 15 minutes long. But during this 3-year stretch, roughly 100 years ago, she wrote, directed, starred in, edited, and titled 1 movie per week. And not that I'm crazy about the idea of using dollar amounts to suggest a person's worth, but I just want to lay this factoid on you. At the height of her career, in 1917, she was earning $5,000 a week. $5,000 a week in 1917 dollars. Now, again, I don't like dwelling on that type of information, but I think it's important to mention because, as we know, the Hollywood movie industry is very bottom line driven, very money driven. It says something about the respect that Hollywood studio executives had for her. She was just as famous as D.W. Griffith, just as famous as Charles Chaplin, but as we all know, women's history tends to get erased. And in the field of the movie industry, the history of the movie industry, the career of Lois Weber is exhibit A of that truism. Because movie histories began being written in the early 1920s, well into the 1930s and beyond. The histories tended to be written by men, and they tended to focus on the contributions of men. And I don't wish to minimize those contributions at all, but the careers of people like Lois Weber were basically left in the dust. And it's a real sad commentary. I mean, just to give you a sense of the kinds of things she did, I mean, I mentioned the hundreds of films she worked on. She made comedies, she made westerns, she made mystery films, she made action-adventure films. But the films for which she's best remembered, and if you know anything about Lois Weber, this may resonate with you, the kinds of movies she was best remembered for are her social commentary films. Here's a woman who is making movies, and these are narrative films, not documentaries, but narrative movies on such topics as birth control, abortion, capital punishment, drug abuse, the Christian Science Church. I mean, a huge range of topics that she was exploring in addition to the more genre-related films that she worked on. She's barely remembered today. Barely remembered today. So one of my self-appointed missions is to restore her voice. And as you may have you may have noticed in the in my abstract, that I'm currently putting together a book that consists of as many of her public utterances as I can find. She did not leave behind an autobiography. She did not leave behind a book of memoirs. There is no archive established in her name. But I did learn from having done prior research using these old newspapers that she gave quite a few newspaper and magazine interviews. And I think she understood the value of cultivating good working relationships with the press, maybe in the hopes of getting favorable movie reviews out on the social. So she freely gave of her time to journalists. And it occurred to me that there is no book that pulls together all of these public utterances. So this will be sort of the next best thing to an autobiography by Lois Weber. Now, I realize I don't have much time, so let me just try to tie in this brief discussion with a handout I just circulated to you. Here is the common thinking about the latter stages of Lois Weber's career. And I base this on the single book that's been written about her so far, a book simply called Lois Weber, written by a fellow named Anthony Slide, came out in 1996. And by the way, what I find really interesting is the subtitle of this book, The Director Who Lost Her Way in History. That is the subtitle of Anthony Slide's book on Lois Weber, The Director Who Lost Her Way in History. As if it's her fault. It's the historian's fault, it's not her fault. Anyway, in this book that he wrote in the mid-90s, he suggested that Weber's career went into a decline shortly after the divorce from her first husband. She was divorced from a fellow named Philip Smalley in 1922, and it was a person with whom she had collaborated on for quite a few movies up to that point. She divorces Philip Smalley in 1922, and then her career started to hit the skids shortly thereafter. And the conclusion that this historian, Anthony Slide, has come to is that she needed a man by her side and that she fell to pieces after the divorce. In fact, just need about this. I'll give you a give you a direct quote. This is right out of Anthony Slide's book. Weber discovered that without the strong masculine presence of Philip Smalley at her side, she could not continue directing. And he also goes on to say, Weber experienced an emotionally draining divorce that seriously damaged her career, and she never fully recovered from the breakup of her marriage. That is the prevailing view of Weber's career in its latter stages. And there's no denying the fact that her career was in a state of decline in the 1920s. But here's an example of a person making a giant leap, connecting those two events, this divorce and the decline in the and one is causing the other. And unfortunately, people who write encyclopedia entries on Weber have picked up on that and have repeated that idea. Now here's where all of this ties in with the handout I distributed. The two-part article that you see in this handout is something I discovered just a few months ago using the optical character recognition technology after having done some database searches through old newspapers. Weber basically wrote a two-part article in 1928, which you have in front of you there, in which she basically refutes the notion that women are poor movie directors. There was a fellow by the name of Jesse Lasky, who was head of one of the big Hollywood movie companies back then, the Paramount Pictures Corporation, came out with a view, and it's mentioned in the editor's note in the first article in that handout, that Lasky was quoted as saying women do not make good movie directors. Weber was asked to respond to that, and she responded with this two-part article that you see in front of you. I'm no psychologist, but to me, the writing that you see there is not the work of an emotionally distraught person. This is not the work of somebody who has, quote unquote, fallen to pieces as a result of a divorce that she had gone through. To me, it's a very level-headed analysis of the changing nature of the American movie business during the 1920s. And although she doesn't use the word sexism, in fact, I think the word had not, I think that word got invented in the 60s, if I'm not mistaken. That's exactly what she's talking about here in this article, the institutionalized sexism that found its way into the American movie industry in the 1920s. And just one last quick thought, because I know I'm running out of time. In an interview that Weber gave in 1920, 8 years before the articles you see in front of you there, this is what she had to say. 1920. This is Weber speaking. I don't know of any other line of endeavor where there are more opportunities for women than in the making of photoplays. And of course, photoplay is the old-fashioned word for movies. She's saying the field is wide open to women as of 1920. But 8 years later, she comes to a very different conclusion, and it's embedded in that first article there. She says, in so many words, the field is now closed to women. You'll see it right there in that first article. The field is now closed to women. And as a historian, the first thing that I ask is why? What happened? What caused her to have that 180-degree difference in opinion about the place of women in that movie industry? And rather than me telling you that, I'll just ask you to read, because she very much addresses the institutionalized sexism that started all the way at the top with the movie executives and trickled all the way down to the individual crew members, the vast majority of whom were male, with whom she had to work. So just as a concluding thought, and on a more general note, what I hope you can see is that with you know, this article, I never would have been able to find with conventional microfilm searching kind of methods. It was one of those things I discovered by doing an optical character recognition search. And I hope you can see the value of this thing, because I mean, my basic argument is that we're now in a position where we can start to, we're more easily able to offer correctives to what we know about the place of women in the American movie industry. Thank you.